This morning we're going to begin a new book, so let's turn to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel is a great book. It really is. One of my favorite Old Testament books, perhaps. 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1 Samuel was written around the 10th century BC, and this book marks the transition from the judges to the monarchy. Samuel is the last judge of Israel, and when he is older, he anoints Saul as king. So during the lifetime and ministry of Samuel, who later anoints David as king, this is a real turning point in Israel's history. Originally, the books that we have today, 1st and 2nd Samuel, originally these were combined in one book. We don't know who the author is. You might assume Samuel, but we're going to see that the book starts out and Samuel isn't even born yet. So we don't know who the author is. But the theme is certainly the lives and events surrounding the main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David. One thing that you need to know about Samuel, he was both a priest and a prophet. And again, he was the last judge of Israel before the monarchy. And now we're going to begin the book by looking at some of the miraculous events surrounding the birth of this great man, this prophet we know as Samuel. So let's begin reading 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, and the son of Elihu, and the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the other was named Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man went up," so this man, Elkanah, the husband of Hannah, he went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. Also, the two sons of Eli were there, Hophni and Phinehas. They were priests of the Lord. That's at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. Verse 4, "And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival," that is this other woman, "also provoked her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her. Therefore Hannah wept and did not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, 'Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?'" Okay, let's stop here. This is a really challenging situation. You have this man, Elkanah, who's clearly involved in polygamy. At least he has two wives. He probably married Hannah first, but because she couldn't have children, he took a second wife. And this second wife, Peninnah, is called Hannah's rival. I guess for obvious reasons. She would say unkind things to her. She had plenty of children, so it looks like she would sort of rub it in. And this hurt Hannah very much. In verse 8, it says her heart was grieved. Some commentators say it wasn't just that she was sad, she was angry. And you can imagine this really difficult to live like that. Now, we talked about this in our Bible study of the book of Judges, because Elkanah, practicing polygamy, the fact is many men in Israel practiced polygamy. And really, it was the wealthy men, so they could sort of get away with that. And yes, that happened. The Bible records it, but here's the thing. Remember, that doesn't make it right. Just because somebody in the Bible did something and that the Bible records it and doesn't automatically condemn it, it doesn't mean that it was right. It doesn't mean that God approved. Let's go back to what we talked about last time we touched on this subject. There is there are some passages that are descriptive, and then there are some passages that are prescriptive. The Ten Commandments are prescriptive. They are God telling people what to do, what not to do. The Bible telling us what's right and what's wrong. This passage, however, is not prescriptive. It's not saying that polygamy, thou shalt commit polygamy. Thou shalt approve of polygamy. That's not what this is. This is descriptive. It's simply telling us what happened. There's no commentary one way or another. Also, it could be argued that back then, in Old Testament times, certain things were overlooked. Many of Israel's leaders were involved in polygamy, and while God did not approve, he didn't really make a big issue of it. Although, if you read about every single time that it's recorded that a man practiced polygamy, it always led to problems. Always. In the New Testament, you see a higher standard. To be a leader in the New Testament church, polygamy is strictly forbidden. Remember, Paul told Timothy one of the qualifications for a bishop is that he must be the husband of one wife. So polygamy is forbidden in the New Testament. But here, this is Old Testament times, book of 1 Samuel, Elkanah is practicing it. But it says that he would go up to Shiloh every year to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts. And that's Lord in all caps. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The Lord. That's the name of God, the memorial name of God, Jehovah. The Lord of hosts, meaning the Lord of armies. Jehovah of armies. And that's a reference to the heavenly hosts. So God has an angelic army. So this man, he went to Shiloh because that's where the tabernacle was, where the Ark of the Covenant was located. Later, David would move the Ark and the tabernacle to Jerusalem, where Zion was made the capital city. But for now, the house of God is at Shiloh. The man serving there as priest is a man named Eli. Eli is not, he's not pictured in a positive way. He's one of these men that kind of let his sons run wild. And he didn't do anything about it, and because of his sort of lax attitude on immorality, or he would condemn it, this is wrong, but he wasn't willing to do anything about it. And I just want you to think about that. There's a lot of church leaders today. They will say, hey, that's wrong, I disagree with that, that's not good, but they're not willing to do anything about it. And the fact that Eli, and we'll get into this later, but the fact that Eli, even though he recognized that what was happening in his own house, the things that he was in charge of, the tabernacle, you could look at it like he was in charge of the church, because he didn't do anything about the problems, God judged him. So pretty serious situation. So Eli is serving as the priest in the tabernacle. When Hannah finally has a child, spoiler alert, if you don't know the story, sorry, but when Hannah finally gives birth to a child, she gives birth to Samuel, and he will be trained by Eli. And this is the story that most people know, that God speaks to the young boy Samuel and pronounces judgment against the house of Eli because his sons were corrupt and he did nothing about it. But point being, right now, Eli is serving as priest at the tabernacle before the Lord in Shiloh. Verse 5 says that the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. So it's not that it just so happened that Hannah couldn't give birth. No, it says that God specifically closed her womb. We read that Elkanah loved Hannah, and the implication is that he loved her more than his other wife. Probably married Hannah first, loves her more, but having children back at this time period was everything, so he felt like, hey, I need children, so he marries this other woman. But Elkanah loved Hannah. And I think we can assume that one of his prayers is that the Lord would give them a son. So this is a similar situation. You think back to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah was barren. God had closed her womb. And then what did Abraham do? He took his second wife, Hagar, and she had a son, and it turned into a contentious relationship. It went bad. And that appears to be what's happening here. So why? Because it says the Lord closed her womb. Why did God close her womb? Well, apparently, he closed it so that when she did have a child, it would be seen as an act of God. I think that's what's happening here. When Samuel finally is born, he is seen as a gift from God. God did something special with this young boy. God would use this young child to accomplish his will and purpose. And of course, that's what the Lord did. When Sarah and Abraham had Isaac, right, that was a miraculous birth. It signaled something big. And when Hannah gives birth to Samuel, same type of thing. And it all demonstrates that God is sovereign and in control. So whether Elkanah is praying for a son, we would assume he is, but we know that Hannah is praying for a son. Look at verse 9. It says, "So Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. And now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul." So Hannah is in bitterness of soul, and she prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant, and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head." So what's Hannah doing? She is making a religious vow. She is making a promise to God. Lord, if you give me a son, I will dedicate him to you. And of course, that's what she ends up doing. Because the young boy Samuel goes to live at the tabernacle, trained by Eli. But not only does Hannah make this promise, she also says she will dedicate him as a Nazirite, referring to the vow, the religious vow of the Nazirite, which included a few things: that a Nazirite would never cut his hair, a Nazirite would not drink wine, and he would not touch anything that is unclean. So some people lived as a lifelong Nazirite. You think of men like Samson. And then others took a temporary Nazirite vow. I think the Apostle Paul did that, if memory serves me correctly. So the last Nazirite we read about was Samson. And really, there's some similarities between Hannah and Samson's mother. But the point is, God answers this prayer. It's a miraculous birth, same with Samson. Hannah commits to giving her son to the Lord. So what's she doing right now? She's out in public. She's out in the open, and she's praying, and she's crying. And look at verse 12. It happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. So this is an unusual way. Typically people don't pray like that. You know, if you pray in your heart, you generally don't move your lips. If you're moving your lips, usually you're talking, but this is how she's praying, and Eli is sitting over there watching this. And it says, therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you." So we can see that Eli assumes the worst. And again, this is sort of an odd thing for someone to do, to pray and their lips are moving, not make any noise. But and maybe he's seen people behave like this before. Whatever the case is, he assumes the worst of her. She must be drunk. But verse 15, Hannah answered and said, "No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now. So she's acting this way, she's crying, he assumes the worst, that she's drunk. And note how drunkenness, according to Hannah, she considers it wicked. She said, don't think that I'm a wicked woman. Now, let's just spend a moment on this. This is sort of one of those issues that sometimes churches avoid, right? Because it's a controversial issue. There's a lot of churches that are very much anti-alcohol. There's some churches that celebrate alcohol. I think it was on Facebook, there was one church that was having a pub Bible study. So come to this bar and we'll have a few brewskis and we'll study the Bible. And this is like posted. Now there's some other churches that if you tried organizing a Bible study in the bar room, you'd probably be kicked out of the church. So, I mean, there's some churches that are totally on opposite ends of the spectrum here. But the Israelites, they did drink wine. Of course, all cultures drank wine. Here's the thing, though. Sometimes it's hard to discern in Scripture whether it's talking about like wine as we would think about it. And even the wine back then was not the same alcohol content of the wine today. It was watered down. But reading the Bible, it'll just say wine, and sometimes it's referring to alcoholic wine. Sometimes it's referring to grape juice. You know, it's the same word used for both. So when the Bible mentions wine, you don't really know whether it's talking about grape juice or like wine. And Christians are divided on this, whether or not God's people should or can drink alcohol. The Baptists and the Pentecostals have traditionally frowned on alcohol use, if not strictly forbidden it. Reformed churches and Presbyterians are more open to it. Sometimes they even celebrate it. Whatever your position is, however, one thing that all Christians have agreed on throughout history, and that Hannah agrees with this, because she expresses this viewpoint, that drunkenness is a very serious transgression. So drunkenness is clearly wrong. In fact, Hannah, she calls it wicked. So Eli assumes the worst. He thinks Hannah is drunk, and she corrects him like, I'm not like one of those wicked women. And then, of course, he's feeling bad. He's kind of feeling dumb making this false accusation. Verse 17, he doesn't really apologize, but he says, go in peace. And the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him. Oh, you're praying? Sorry that I called you a drunkard. You're praying? Well, God bless you. I hope that God answers your prayer. That's what he's saying. And she said, verse 18, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So now she's feeling at peace. She has prayed to God, poured out her heart, Lord, give me a son. And then the man who's ministering before the Ark of the Covenant says, may God answer your prayer. So she's feeling pretty good. I think she has faith at this point. Based on everything that's happened, God is going to give me a son. So she's no longer sad. And here's the interesting thing with Eli. Now Eli is directly involved in this situation. And the interesting thing is when Hannah gives birth to Samuel, God is going to use the young boy, Samuel, to actually speak against the house of Eli. God is going to judge Eli's house, and Samuel is going to act as God's mouthpiece. He's going to, look at it this way, Samuel is going to become a prophet at a very young age. I don't know, this just came to me, and I'm not sure, I'd have to think about it. But is Samuel the youngest prophet in the Bible? Maybe. We'll touch on that probably next time. So Eli accuses this righteous woman, Hannah, of great sin. Here's I don't know if it's the irony or the hypocrisy. The sad thing is, he accuses a righteous woman of great sin, but Eli's own children, his own sons, were out committing evil. It says they were laying with women, like they were using the tabernacle to pick up girls, basically. And they were doing it right there. And Eli knew about it, but he wasn't doing anything about it. And that's why God ends up judging him, because he knew of this great sin happening and he just refused to do anything about it. In chapter 3, we will read about how his sons, it says, his sons made themselves vile, and yet Eli did not restrain them. You know, there's some people that, you know, off on their own, out on the town, at home, on a Friday night, they probably would be willing to do certain things, but they wouldn't dare do it in church. Like most people have the decency that, well, I would never do this at church. I might do it somewhere else, but I wouldn't do it at church. Well, Eli's sons were actually committing these deeds right there at the tabernacle. So this is really a high-handed insult, to say the least, against the Lord. So Eli not looking very good. Elkanah practicing polygamy, he's not looking too good. Peninnah, she's rubbing it in that she has children. She's the rival of this godly woman, Hannah. She doesn't look very good. Who looks good in this story? Hannah. Hannah has been mistreated. And you know what God does to people who have been mistreated? God fights for those people. God vindicates those people. Look at verse 19. Then they rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him from the Lord. Okay, so his name is called Samuel, and this is common in the Old Testament, maybe the New Testament too. When somebody gives someone a name, what they say next is oftentimes what that name means. You know, he was called Samuel because I asked him for the Lord. So the name Samuel means heard by God. Hannah asked for him, and God heard her prayer. So his name is Samuel. And anytime a name ends, because heard by God, so the name, God's name is contained within the name Samuel. Samuel ends with, Samuel. So anytime a name ends with the letters El, that's the other Old Testament name for God, El. You think of Elohim, that's the plural name for God. There's El Shaddai, God Almighty. So El means God. So anytime you see El in someone's name, that means whatever their name means, the name of God is contained in their name. So my name is Michael. It ends with El. Michael means who is like God. So you think of the archangel Michael, he is like God. The name Joel, or Joel, Joel, means related to God. The name Nathaniel, ending with El, means gift of God. So if your name ends with El, something about God is in the meaning of your name. So when Hannah, whose name means grace, gives birth to Samuel, meaning heard by God, it literally was, the birth of Samuel was literally an answer to prayer. Verse 21, now the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, not until the child is weaned. Then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. So we see that, number one, Hannah intends to keep her vow. But number 2, she wants some time alone raising the young child. So Hannah is going to spend at least a couple years raising Samuel. The fact that he ends up serving at the tabernacle as a priest and grows up to be a prophet. Elkanah's second wife, what is one thing you can draw from this? She's no longer Hannah's rival. Peninnah is no longer the rival. Hannah is number one wife. At least she's probably feeling like she feels vindicated. And really, Hannah goes down in history as just being one of those godly mothers. When you think of godly mothers in the Bible, you think of Hannah. Because she's the mother of one of the greatest men in Israelite history. One of the greatest prophets Israel ever produced. So she's vindicated. Verse 23, so Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only let the Lord establish his word." Then the woman stayed and nursed her son until she weaned him. So that means she would have kept Samuel until he was probably about 3 years old, give or take. Verse 24, now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. Then they slaughtered a bull and brought the child to Eli. So they're making sacrifices, and they bring the young child Samuel to the priest Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here praying to the Lord." Like, what's she saying? She's like, do you remember me? Remember that time you thought I was drunk and I was actually praying to God? Well, he answered my prayer, and here's what happened, and here's my son. Verse 27, for this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. Commentator Matthew Henry writes this: Hannah presented her child to the Lord with a great acknowledgement of his goodness in answer to prayer. Whatever we give to God, it is what we have first asked and received from him. Let me read that again. Whatever we give to God, it is what we have first asked and received from him. Do you realize all our gifts to God, everything that we give to God, he first gave to us? Isn't that true? Everything we have is a gift from God. James 1:17, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. The Lord gave Samuel to Hannah. So what does Hannah do? She gave Samuel back to the Lord. This is what God does. He does it with the spiritual gifts. He gives us an ability. He gives people a talent, and in return, we give it back and use it to serve God and his people. God gives us our health. He allows us to earn a living, giving us an opportunity to then give him some of that back in our tithes and offerings. Whatever God gives to us, we want to give it back to him. The rewards we receive in glory, what do? We give them back, as it were. We use those things to serve God, as pictured in the book of Revelation when the elders take their crowns given to them by the Lord. And what do? They cast their crowns down before the Lord's feet. And of course, life itself is a gift, which is why we are told to present our bodies to the Lord as a living sacrifice. This, Paul says in Romans 12, is our reasonable service. God gives to us, and we give back to him. Hannah was happy to give her child so that the Lord could use him. And boy, did God use Samuel in a mighty way. From his earliest years, Samuel was in the house of God. And let's end on this point. and draw application from this. From his earliest years, maybe 3 years old, Samuel was raised in God's house. So in conclusion, this establishes really what is a pattern for us to follow. That our children, and each generation from the time of their youth, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, they should know what it's like to be brought up in the house of God, which in this age is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. God has given them to us so that we might raise them to serve him. I'll close with verse 28. Hannah says about her son Samuel, "Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." So they worship the Lord there.